Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholars Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with over 700 organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, lay or professionally led. To learn more, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email at chaimitzvah.org. Our featured scholar tonight is Dr. Andrew Pessin, Professor of Philosophy and Jewish Studies at Connecticut College and Campus Bureau Editor of the Allgemeiner. His many books include Anti-Zionism on Campus, Poisoning the Well, Anti-Semitism in Contemporary America, and The Jewish God Question, as well as several novels. One recent novel is Nevergreen, a satirical and now clearly prophetic account of campus cancel culture, its ideological excesses, and its deleterious impact on the Jews. Long ago, he enjoyed some moments of fame portraying the genius on the David Letterman show. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to you in your email in a few days and will be available again on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Andrew Pessin.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you to Chai Mitzvah. Thank you to everybody who's shown up tonight and everyone who might be watching the recording. Let me go ahead and share the screen. Get this into slideshow. Just give me a second. I assume that everybody can see that. So it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful to be here tonight. The circumstances, unfortunately, are not so wonderful given the situation in the Middle East and so forth. But that's what we're here to talk about a little bit, to learn how to push back against the many lies that are told about Israel on campuses and elsewhere. If you are interested in these issues, in particular, if you're interested in the campus situation, that's sort of my particular area of competence, please do follow me on Twitter. I have a Substack. Please subscribe to my Substack. It's free. I moderate a Facebook group called Anti-Zionism on Campus. Come join us there if you're on Facebook. And certainly sign up for the Allgemeiner. It's a wonderful news outlet that focuses on Jews and Israel, and I am the campus bureau editor, so my job is to focus on the campus there. So to stay abreast of what's happening, you can do a little better than to sign up for the daily newsletter from Allgemeiner at allgemeiner.com. And just in general, check out my most recent novel, Bright College Years. It's about what colleges used to be before they all went crazy. So our job is to dispel some of the myths. I prefer the stronger language, refute some of the lies about Israel that are told on campuses and elsewhere. This is the third part of a 3-part series. The plan is to be quite thorough. I want to give people serious tools and resources. So this will be a bit more detailed than many webinars are. But you should know I've written it all up as an article now. The article, really a monograph, will be published sometime in the near future by ISCAP. If you want to stay abreast of that, sign up for my Substack. I'll certainly announce it there. So everything I talk about tonight will be available in written form in the very near future. So let's get going. We are examining and refuting thoroughly some of the major lies told about Israel on campus. All of this is part of the Nazi strategy of the big lie. I won't read this long paragraph from Hitler, but the big lie is a lie that's so big that people can't believe you would say it, so therefore it must be true. And this was a deliberate and explicit strategy by the Nazis to tell these big lies, in particular about the Jews, to pave the way ultimately towards the Holocaust. That there are so many of them and that they're so big and so widespread shows that the campaign against Israel isn't just about misinformation or undereducation or something like that, nor is it a matter of critiquing particular Israeli practices or policies, which anybody can do, and Israelis first and foremost. it shows it's actually a deliberate bad faith campaign to dehumanize, delegitimize, and demonize Israel and Jews and paint them as being the epitome of evil, which then, of course, justifies boycotting, persecuting, attacking, even killing them as per October 7th. So it's part of a strategy paving the way to justify really the elimination of Israel and ultimately of the Jews. And this sort of campaign is what explains, I think, the success of the campus campaign against Jews for those who've been following the campus scene over the past 10 months. The set of lies that I'm dealing with in this series and in the forthcoming monograph put together create what I like to call the false narrative. And it's worth reading this because this is the whole story here. There once was a country called Palestine, existing from time immemorial, filled mostly with Palestinians and a few Jews who got along nicely. Then the Jews started arriving from Europe in the 20th century, committing genocide, and there's scare quotes around a lot of these, committing genocide against many Palestinians and expelling most of the rest, ethnic cleansing, as part of their project of settler colonialism, thus coming to occupy Palestinian land and building illegal settlements. Those Palestinians who remained in Israel and their descendants are kept subjugated under apartheid, a political system that reflects Jewish supremacy. Those who were expelled to the West Bank now live under that crippling occupation, while those who were expelled to Gaza are kept or were kept in an open air prison. All of the above reveals that Zionism is racism and resistance to Zionism by any means necessary is entirely justified, including the rapes, tortures, murders, massacre of October 7th. So you can't pack more lies into a short space than what you have here composing the false narrative. And this is the dominant anti-Israel campus narrative that is believed by, swallowed by so many people on so many campuses. In the first two sessions, we got through the first 5 lies. In the interest, I'm hoping to get through 2 more tonight. In the interest of time, I won't review the responses to those first 5 lies, other than to stress the long history of Jewish sovereignty, autonomy, and presence in the land of Israel, stretching back 3,500 years or more. Jews as being a people indigenous to the region, the original indigenous inhabitants to that region, and also to note a bunch of statistics which show how ludicrous the charges of genocide and ethnic cleansing are, whether applied to the War of Independence in 1948, the years since, and especially with respect to the current campaign in Gaza, which, as I'm sure everyone here knows, is regularly referred to as an side, and that simply could not be more ludicrous. So that's where we were up to this point. We're going to pick it up with lie 6. So give me a second to find it. Don't worry, we won't go through all this tonight. There we go. So lie 6, the idea that Israel occupies Palestine or occupies Palestinian land. This lie, as you see in these signs and stickers and all over campuses, this lie is so entrenched that the very title of the current International Court of Justice case against Israel is the legal consequences arising from the policies and practice of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. And of course, it was the recent finding of that same kangaroo court that Israel is guilty of occupation, and that's what we're going to push back against right now. Some initial remarks, a few initial remarks on this subject. This particular lie comes in more moderate and more extreme versions. The moderate version is that only the West Bank, or what I will call in a moment, Judea and Samaria, only that territory is occupied Palestinian territory, and only there is Jewish settlement illegal. The more extreme version, of course, is that the entire state of Israel is occupied Palestinian territory, including even Gaza, which is prior to October 7th. The extreme view, however, despite its being ludicrous, absurd, and offensive, is in fact the dominant view on campuses and in progressive circles to this day. It's perhaps controversial whether I should call the moderate version that only sees Judea, Samaria as occupied. It's maybe controversial to call that a lie because many Jews and even some left-leaning but bona fide Zionists endorse that position. In any case, I will focus on the moderate version here because the extreme version is really ludicrous in my view. it's largely refuted by our previous sessions, and it's the really most relevant to the Jewish community today. Terminological, much of the world calls the region of dispute the West Bank in the moderate version here. I think that's a bad term for various reasons. It's historically misleading. The area was known as Judea and Samaria literally since biblical times. And the term West Bank, and even the idea of demarcating that particular region off as a separate region, only came into use after Jordan conquered it in 1948 to reflect that territory allegedly belonging to Jordan. And moreover, the term West Bank already biases the argument against the stronger pro-Israel position. To refer to it as Judea Samaria is to remind everyone of its very long history as a Jewish land. It's the biblical heartland. To call it the West Bank, carve it off as a separate entity from the rest of the land of Israel, and gives it the name that the enemies of Israel gave it as part of their unjustified claim on it. So I will generally speak of Judea, Samaria, and not the West Bank. And I urge you to do the same out there in the world. And one important note. You can reject the claim that Israel illegally occupies and illegally settles this region and still hold that Israel shouldn't have sovereignty or build in that region. You may reasonably believe that peace requires two states, perhaps, and that two states requires Israeli withdrawal from the region, even if you believe that Israel is not occupying it and actually has a legal right to be there. If that's your view, Israel withdrawing would be a concession that Israel makes. It has the right to be there, but maybe it's not a good idea for it to be there. And so it would be a concession. If you hold that it's illegal to be there, then it's not a concession, it becomes an obligation. And there are a decent number of Jews, especially left-leaning Jews, who have that position have that position that Israel should withdraw from Judea, Samaria. The point I want to make here and tonight is Israel's presence there is not an occupation, and settlements there are not illegal, even if you think it's a good idea for Israel to withdraw. Okay, so those are the initial remarks. Let's turn to the main subject. We'll start with the short response first. Technically and legally, there is no occupation at all. Israel is a legally recognized UN member state, and with the Oslo Accords from the early 90s, even the Palestinians acknowledged that that ended the occupation of that territory. It did so by accepting that certain areas were to be administered by the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, and other areas were to be administered by Israel. So that's the end of the occupation there. They've essentially divided the territory up. Furthermore, we'll add to that, it literally doesn't make sense to talk about occupied Palestine as there never previously existed an Arab state called Palestine. So one may wish the land belonged to the Palestinians. One may believe it should belong to the Palestinians, maybe as a result of negotiations and a two-state solution, but that doesn't make it occupied Palestine. What is occupation, strictly speaking? There's a very large literature on this subject, but the simple idea, again, is that one country occupies another when it crosses an international boundary and takes over the sovereign territory of the second country. Neither of those conditions is met in this particular case. There wasn't an international border. In fact, the 1948 lines, the Green Line, is an armistice line. It's a ceasefire line, and the Arabs rejected calling that a border because doing so would acknowledge the reality of the state of Israel. So the Arabs themselves said that is not a border, so no border was crossed when Israel captured that territory. And of course, there never was a sovereign Arab country called Palestine, so it cannot literally be occupied. It simply does not make sense. We'll skip most of the brief historical interlude, so we'll make it super duper brief. But how did Israel come to be in possession of these territories? The War of Independence in 1948 ended with Jordan in control of Judea and Samaria and Egypt in control of Gaza. Again, they refused to make peace and refused to consider those borders. In 1967, focusing on Judea Samaria, Jordan attacked Israel, and Israel in a defensive war defeated Jordan and kicked Jordan out and recaptured those territories. And so for the more moderate version, this was the beginning of the occupation. But now note, the territories were captured not from Palestine, not from the Palestinians. They were captured from Jordan and Egypt for Gaza, right? So once again, if Jordan had sovereignty over that region, it would be occupied Jordan, but actually nobody recognized Jordan's sovereignty over the region. And prior to that, it was simply British Mandate territory. So it was not the sovereign possession of the state of Palestine. And therefore, once again, it was taken from the state of Jordan, and therefore it cannot be occupied Palestinian territory. Again, you might reasonably wish the Palestinians had a state there. You might hope that that's the outcome of negotiations and a two-state solution, but that doesn't make it Palestine, and therefore does not make it occupied Palestine. Let's add to that historical interlude one more little point. The Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 1964, the famous PLO, to be headed by Yasser Arafat for many, many decades, and now by Mahmoud Abbas. In their founding charter in 1964, they openly declared that they had no territorial claim on what they called the West Bank and Gaza. Think about that. The Palestinians themselves in 1964 said they don't even have a claim on that territory. They were perfectly happy for Jordan to control it. They did not claim it for themselves. So once again, it wasn't Palestine, and therefore it isn't occupied Palestine, and Israel is not occupying Palestinian territory. Whoops, wrong way. We'll skip that one. There is maybe a very loose sense that one might be open to that language. I'm not, but some might reasonably be. Maybe occupation, that language makes sense, you could argue, on a demographic level. Judea Samaria does have a significant majority Arab Palestinian population. So maybe in that loose sense, demographically speaking, it's Palestinian territory, not legally or technically as a country or a state, but just simply the majority population there is Arab Palestinian. The well-known Israeli commentator Mika Goodman likes to say that Israel is not occupying Palestinian land, but they're occupying the Palestinian people, which is at least a little closer to reality there. So maybe you're inclined to speak that way in that loose sense of occupation, but do consider two things. First, what produced that significant Arab population majority in that territory? Well, Jordan in 1948 ethnically cleansed the area, driving out some tens of thousands of Jews who lived there, and then forbid any Jews to re-enter until after 1967 when Israel captured that territory. So the region may feel Palestinian because of the Palestinian majority, but that's partly aided by the fact that the Arabs expelled all the Jews from there. Second, once again, that's a very loose sense of occupation. Maybe one could argue they occupy the Palestinian people, but it's not a legal occupation. It's not the occupation of a country. So once again, it is not occupied Palestine. That's simply not true. Let's talk briefly about Gaza, because you should know that some people actually make the case that I'm about to refute, even though it seems ridiculous. Brief historical interlude, Gaza Strip, Israel recaptured that from Egypt in 1967, but withdrew from there in 2005, withdrew something like 8,000 of its citizens and some dozens of settlements, and also withdrew all of its legal claims. It said, it's not ours, we have no sovereignty here, and literally gave it to the Palestinian people. So no serious person could consider it occupied after that moment. Nevertheless, the haters do sometimes claim that Gaza was still occupied up to October 7th because Israel had some control over Gazan borders. But that's simply not what occupation means in international law. Occupation requires literally controlling the territory and having boots on the ground. And if there's one thing that October 7th demonstrated, it's that Israel had no control over what was going on in that territory. And in any case, Egypt controls the southern border of Gaza, not Israel. So even on that ridiculous sense of occupation that they control the borders, it just simply isn't true. Okay, so yeah, we'll move on from there. More importantly, or maybe taking a slightly different direction now. Suppose we say it's not occupied Palestinian territory. There never was a Palestine there to be occupied. But could one say it's still Israeli occupied territory? Wikipedia defines a military occupation as follows. It's the case when it is the temporary military control by a ruling power over a territory that is outside that power's sovereign territory. So if Judea and Samaria are not part of Israel's sovereign territory, then you could call it Israeli occupied territory, even though we've now refuted that it's occupied Palestinian territory. So the question here becomes, well, what exactly constitutes Israel's sovereign territory? This is a complex topic, but I did want to at least introduce you to these fellows, Avraham Bell and Eugene Kontorovich, both excellent legal scholars, very important people to listen to and follow on these issues. They published a paper some years back. I have that excerpt right there in the upper left, making the claim, a very interesting legal claim from the perspective of international law, that Israel, in fact, has the best claim to sovereignty of the region. And I should mention that the recent ICJ ruling, which went against Israel in this kangaroo court, you should read the dissenting opinions to that. They're quite brilliant. And one of the dissenting justices, the South African justice of all the ironies, I suppose, actually essentially cited the Bell Kontorovich idea here. So it's a serious legal idea. So what is this idea? There's a legal principle called uti possidetis juris, which means you possess under the law. It's in this paper, they argue it is in fact widely accepted in international law and in fact gets applied to all other similar cases to the ones that we're talking about here, the establishment of Israel and so forth. And the principle basically says this: emerging states, newly formed states. And by the way, lest we think that the current map has been around for a long time, you might be surprised to know that of the, I don't know, 190 countries in the United Nations, Israel is in the top third of oldest. 2/3 of the countries in the United Nations are younger than Israel. Point being that new states are forming all the time. Borders are constantly shifting, as we know from the 20th and 21st century. So this principle says emerging states, newly formed states, presumptively inherit their pre-independence administrative boundaries. So when a new state is formed, the presumption is, unless various factors override it, none of which are relevant here, the assumption is that the new state will have the same borders it had as when it was being administered previously. Well, the British Mandate was the last internationally recognized border in this region. Remember, the Ottoman Empire in World War I was defeated and literally dismantled, and most of the states in the Middle East were formed at that point as they broke up the Ottoman Empire. So the Mandate was the last internationally recognized border. The 1948 War of Independence for Israel, ended not in peace, not with a treaty or agreement about borders of new states, but only armistice, only a ceasefire. And armistice lines, as I've said a few times now, are not borders. In fact, again, the Arabs refused to make peace and refused to recognize the armistice lines as borders because that would be to grant the existence of Israel. And in 1967, Israel merely captured that territory in a defensive war. That it was defensive is important because there's also a general principle in international law that you cannot keep territory captured in an offensive war, an aggressive war, but in a defensive war you can, and this was clearly in 1967 a defensive war, capturing territory that was legally established by the League of Nations and the United Nations to make a Jewish homeland, ultimately. And so the last borders it had was the British Mandate, and the newly formed state presumptively has those borders, and that is the Jewish state there. So in short, Jews are not occupiers of this land, but actually have sovereignty there by the actual principles of international law that are followed everywhere else. And if they have sovereignty, they're certainly entitled to settle there, to build there. And this fact could not have a sturdier basis in international law. So it is simply a lie to claim that Israel occupies Palestinian territory. And it's even a lie, or at least a falsehood, to claim that Israel occupies that territory, even if it isn't Palestinian territory. Lastly, the last point on this subject, the whole narrative of Israeli occupation ignores the multiple peace offers that Israel has made that would have established a Palestinian state alongside the Jewish one. Israel didn't merely withdraw from Gaza, but withdrew from much of Judea and Samaria, and subsequently made massive concessions to the Palestinians to reach a final status two-state solution. They withdrew from Gaza as well. The Palestinians rejected this every single time because arguably their goal was not to establish a Palestinian state, but to destroy the Jewish state. The point now is it's very odd to complain that these territories are your occupied territories at the same time as you reject multiple offers to gain sovereignty over them. So I think the conclusion is that we should go with Israel's official and correct position, call these disputed territories that perhaps both parties have a claim to, rather than call them occupied territories. As we saw with many of the previous lies in previous sessions as well, not only is it not the case that Israel is guilty of the charge being levied against it, but it's often the case that the other side is guilty of it, and that is true here as well, at least in a certain sense. Given the long arc of Jewish history from the Jewish perspective, their land, Jewish land, given by God but settled and built by them, a land in which they enjoyed sovereignty or autonomy or significant presence for at least 1400 years before the Roman exile. That land has been subject to a series of colonial occupations going way back. There was the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Arabs, and then various fluctuations back and forth between the Muslims and the crusading Christians, and then the Ottomans, and then the British. And in 1948, it was Jewish again. Given the long arc of the Arab Muslim conquest of the entire Middle East and North Africa, it's pretty clear that it's the Arabs and the Muslims who are the imperialists and the colonists here, and that, in fact, they were the ones occupying the territory, and that what the Jews simply did was liberate their occupied territory. Add this to the Kantorovich claim that international law justifies Israeli sovereignty, and it's pretty clear again that the Arabs are the occupiers of this land, both Judea, Samaria, and even Gaza. Even Gaza. Israel has withdrawn its claim to Gaza, so that's an agreement that overrides the previous situation. But nevertheless, it's not the Jews who are the occupiers; it's actually the Arabs. All right, that was lie 6. I think we'll have time to do lie 7, so that's wonderful. Lie 7 pretty clearly goes hand in hand with lie 6. If Israel's occupying the territory, it doesn't belong to them, and therefore it seems natural to believe that if Israel is building in that territory, building what are called settlements, and we'll come back to terminology in a moment, then those settlements would be presumably illegal. So that's the claim that that Jewish communities is the more neutral term. Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are illegal, violate international law in some sense or another. A few initial remarks again. Again, there's a moderate versus more extreme version of this. The more moderate position is merely settlement in Judea, Samaria, and also East Jerusalem are illegal. The extreme position is, of course, all Jewish residents in the land of Israel is illegal. We'll focus on the moderate position once again. Once again, you can also be reasonably against Jewish settlement activity in Judea, Samaria for various reasons, including that you think it's not conducive to peace or a two-state solution. But that's different from calling it illegal once again. It might be perfectly legal, but a bad idea for various reasons. And it's important to stress that if it's legal and you decide not to do it, you're making a concession. If it's illegal, then you're obligated to give that up, right? It changes your negotiating stance quite dramatically. So it's important to be clear here. I'm going simply to argue that these communities are not illegal. I'm staying neutral on the question of whether they're advisable or a good idea. This question, of course, is particularly timely in light of, first of all, the recent ICJ ruling, which declared them illegal once again. And also timely in light of the Biden administration's decision in February of this year to reverse the Trump era policy declaring the settlements now to be inconsistent with international law. So the Trump administration had said they were legal. Biden reversed that in February of 2024. So this is a particularly timely case. And one does have to acknowledge that the majority opinion, I suppose, if you took a vote in the world, well, that's not meaningful because the world is filled with anti-Semites. But nevertheless, if you took a vote in the world, probably the majority opinion is that these communities are illegal. But truth isn't a democracy, right? That truth isn't a democracy. And what you have to do is look at the arguments. And I, for one, find the arguments on the other side far more compelling, and I want to present some of those to you. And lastly, the terminology. Settlers, settlements have very negative connotations. When you call somebody a settler these days, it goes along with colonial settlerism, and it implies you don't belong there, you're an outsider coming in, and that supports certainly the negative connotation that they might be illegal. I'm going to use, therefore, the more neutral term. These are Jewish communities in this region. Interestingly, the Arabs build all over the place, and no one ever calls those settlements. They just call those communities or neighborhoods. But as soon as a Jew is building in that region, it's called a settlement. So we'll stick with the more neutral term, communities, as much as we can. All right, the relevant documents with respect to the legality of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, most important and most directly relevant are the Geneva Conventions. Here's a little blurb. I won't read these about the Geneva Conventions, but these are important international documents widely adopted after World War II to sort of set out the rules of war and the legal norms that should apply to military conflicts. The most relevant to our discussion right now is the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49, which you have on the screen right there, and in particular, paragraph 6. But I first do want to read just the first line there. This whole convention is dealing with rules about military occupations, and this article, as you see from the top, is dealing with the question of forcible transfers, forcing people to move. And so just reading the first paragraph, individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or any other country, are prohibited regardless of their motive, i.e., you are never allowed to force people to move. Keep that in mind. Regardless of their motive. Doesn't matter what the motive of the transfer is, you're not allowed to force people to move, ever. Going down to paragraph 6, this is the one that gets all the action. The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. So that's the key one. That's where the debate is all about. That the anti-Israel folks claim that Israel has violated this by building in the territories that it captured. And we will take a look at that. The first response to this is, of course, if you accepted the argument against the previous lie, if this is not occupied territory, then, and if this is Israeli sovereign territory, as Bell and Kontorovich argued, I think quite persuasively, then the entire Geneva Convention doesn't apply. These are only the rules that govern occupations. If it's not an occupation, none of this applies. And of course, common sense wise, if it's not an occupation, then it's Israeli territory. So of course, Israelis can live there and Jews can live there and build there. So that's the first point, and it's a very important point as people get into the nitty-gritty about this document. I think the case can be made this document isn't even relevant. It just simply doesn't apply. The other major point to make here is that Jews moved to these territories not as a matter of deportation or transfer, as in mass forcible transfers in the first line of the article, but entirely voluntarily. They were not deported. They were not transferred against their will. The whole article is about forcible transfers. And once again, that simply doesn't apply. The communities that were built in Judea and Samaria are individual Jews voluntarily choosing to move to these regions. So once again, this article simply doesn't apply. We can go a little further on this. Let's see. Why is that not 71? On the common level a little bit, keep in mind that many of the original settlements, i.e. communities, for example, Hebron and Gush Etzion, consisted of Jews returning to communities they had long lived in before 1948 when they were expelled by Jordan in its ethnic cleansing and massacres. Okay? The Hebron Jewish community, as many of you will know, dates back to biblical times. It got cleared out in 1929 from a famous massacre there. So the first settlements, i.e. communities, were Jews literally returning to places that they had lived for decades or centuries or even millennia in the case of Hebron. Imagine calling that somehow illegal. It's literally absurd. Um, Nor does the Geneva Convention prohibit the movement of individuals to land which is not under the legitimate sovereignty of any state and which is not subject to private ownership. Remember, in 1967, even if you want to say this is disputed territory, Jordan had it, and no one thought Jordan had a legitimate claim to it, except the British, weirdly. But the whole rest of the world denied Jordan had sovereignty there. So when Israel captured it, either Israel has sovereignty or no one has sovereignty, and the Geneva Convention does not prohibit people moving to a place that isn't part of any state, as long as it isn't privately owned by anybody. And you should know that the settlement process, the permissions that are needed, they do exhaustive investigations to make sure the land isn't privately owned by anybody. And in that occasional circumstance where they discover that a set of community is being established on land that is owned privately by someone, they get dismantled, right? So again, the Geneva Convention simply does not apply here. So how did this lie take root then? It took root precisely because the Geneva Convention did not preclude voluntary Jewish settlement or community building in the ancestral Jewish heartland. Anti-Israelists added provisions to international law later, after the fact, to make that activity illegal in retrospect, right? Imagine something's legal and then you pass a law later and make it illegal, and then you claim the people are guilty of something illegal. The details here have to do with the drafting of the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court, ICC, in 1998, which is also coming after Israel, of course. Most delegations wanted to keep the language the same as Geneva Conventions, but the Arab delegations insisted on changing the language to make occupying powers guilty not only when they actively transferred citizens into an occupied territory, but if they did not actively stop citizens from going on their own. Right? Western powers basically caved into this hijacking of international law for political purposes, producing the bitter, repulsive irony of suggesting that Israel somehow has a legal responsibility to keep the ancestral Jewish heartland, Judenrein, free of Jews, just as the Arabs and Nazis sought to do for their territories. This law was crafted precisely because Geneva did not forbid it. Israel and the United States never accepted the Rome Statute and don't accept the ICC precisely because of its obviously political nature, developing this law just to single out Israel in this absurd way. Okay, practical matters will be wrapping up in the next couple of minutes. On a purely practical note, after 1967, Israel tried to give the territories back in exchange for peace, land for peace, and was repeatedly rebuffed. The settlement enterprise actually began very slowly, starting in the 70s, reclaiming the Jewish communities that they'd been expelled from earlier, as we mentioned. But as the years went by and Arabs continued to be recalcitrant, the communities started to grow. And why not? Why shouldn't they? The Arabs were clearly not eager to get the territory back. The Israeli population was growing. There's a housing shortage as we speak to this day. Judea, Samaria are the biblical heartland. Why shouldn't they grow if the Arabs are not interested in reaching a peace agreement in which they would take those territories back? If those communities are so evil, the Arabs have had multiple opportunities to make peace and stop the building of those communities, especially 2000, 2008, and other opportunities. And lastly, why exactly are these communities an obstacle to peace or not conducive to peace, as some people claim? If nearly 22% of the Israeli population is Arab, why can't 22% of the future Palestine state be a Jewish minority as well. Even assuming we go to a two-state solution and Judea Samaria becomes the heart of Palestine, why can't it include up to a 22% Jewish minority? Why should Arabs be allowed to live in the Jewish state, but not Jews in the Arab state? It's a really important point that people rarely make, that the demand to remove these settlements is just grossly asymmetric and grossly unfair. Right? And lastly, make the last point. This could be long and complicated. I'll do it very briefly since we're just about out of time. Once again, the reverse of the claim is true. So I've argued that these Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are not at all illegal for numerous reasons, starting from the fact that it's not an occupation. And even if it were an occupation, the folks move there voluntarily. So they're not illegal. Where there is a legal building, we have to skip a bit here, is in fact in A, so per the Oslo agreements, the Judea Samaria were divided into three areas, A, B, and C. Palestinians have complete authority over A. Israel has complete authority over Area C, and there's a joint authority over Areas B. Area C is essentially Israel, complete, and Palestinians agreed to this. Israel has complete control over who lives there and who builds there, etc. The Palestinians in the past 10 or more years have been engaging in a massive campaign of illegal building in Area C, making land grabs. And most of this building has been widely funded by the European Union. Right? So if anything is an illegal settlement, it is these settlements. They are literally violating Oslo, which is international law. And they are, as I said, funded by the European Union, which is one of the guaranteeing parties of the Oslo agreements. It's amongst the many signs of European treachery recently and going back some years now. And in fact, at one point, you see one of these headlines, the bottom left. This is from the blogger Elder of Zion, whom I recommend all of you to follow regularly. He's one of the best pro-Israel bloggers out there. The EU defines chutzpah. It demands compensation from Israel for demolishing illegal buildings. So after Israel demolishes some of these buildings, a small percentage of them, the European Union demanded Israel pay them back for having funded the illegal building. It's insanity. So if illegal settlement, if there's occupation, it's the Arabs, it's the Palestinians who are guilty of it. So those were just two of the many lies. My monograph should be out. I'm hoping sometime early September. All of this will be written up in some detail with lots of sources and footnotes and things like that, so you can check the original text. And there's many more important lies we haven't had a chance to get to, including apartheid. That would have been next had we had more time. But check out the monograph when it comes out. Sign up for my Substack so you can be alerted. I think we have some time then. If there are questions, I'm happy to turn to those and do my best. Thank you very much for attending and being with me to this point.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Pessin. Yes, there are a number of questions. Here's a question from Marsha Saltz, who says, how does the information about evacuation, transfer, etc. apply to the current Gaza situation?
I'm not sure. Could you read the question again? How does the information about evacuation?
Information that you believe about Geneva, about the evacuations, transfers, etc., apply to Gaza, as opposed to Judea and Samaria.
Right. So I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but what I'll say is Israel doesn't, no serious person says that Israel occupies Gaza. There are some anti-Israelists out there who like to make that claim. Israel prior to October 7th, right now Israel is occupying Gaza, right? The army's there and controlling at least parts of Gaza. But prior to October 7th, Israel didn't occupy Gaza. And therefore the Geneva Convention literally just doesn't apply at all. It's simply not relevant. However, one of the points, and maybe this is what Marsh getting at here, I skipped through it right at the end. There was a slide there. Remember, maybe this was your point. The first paragraph of Article 49 said forcible transfers are never permitted, period. No exceptions, right? And there was a little bit more about that, which I didn't discuss. What Israel did, arguably, in evacuating its own citizens, its 8,000 citizens back in 2005, I believe it was, may well have been a violation of international law, right? They did not go, most of them did not go voluntarily, or many of them did not go voluntarily. They had to be dragging and screaming. So Israel, possibly, I'm not an expert enough to say this with certainty, but as far as I can see, international law, which absolutely prohibits involuntary transfers, Israel committed that against its own citizens in evacuating Gaza. And so no one can say Israel occupies Gaza, so the Geneva Convention doesn't apply. But that key idea that mass forcible transfers are never permitted seems to have been violated in evacuating Gaza of Jews, of Israeli citizens. I hope that answers the question.
Um, so, so here's a question from an anonymous attendee. Please explain how there can be Palestinians if there is and never was a sovereign state called Palestine. Who are the people calling themselves Palestinians?
Oh, that is a great question. That is a great question, and it's a minefield of a question. So thank you, anonymous. I'm trying to see how I can do a short version of this. If you go to, for example, the PLO's founding charter and founding documents, they define who a Palestinian is, and a Palestinian is, if I have it correctly, basically an Arab who was living in Palestine. I might be confusing this with the UNRWA definition, but that's fine. Living in Palestine basically for a couple of years before 1948, right? And so Palestine there, of course, means the mandate of Palestine, the British mandate for Palestine. It's not that there wasn't a country called Palestine. It just wasn't an Arab sovereign country called Palestine. It was British. British had legal sovereignty over Palestine until 1948. So there was a place called Palestine. It's a geographical place. It's a region. I can say a lot about geography. It's important in a longer conversation. And so an Arab who lived in that region becomes a Palestinian there. It's geographic, and that's the basis of it. What's interesting about a geographic designation, so if you lived in Palestine, you're a Palestinian. That's it. It's not an ethnicity. Like, to be a Jew, you're a Jew wherever you live. It doesn't matter where you live or what time you lived. It's you inherit your Judaism, or from the religious perspective, you can convert to Judaism. But to be a Palestinian is to just have been a person living in a certain place. They may not be ethnically distinct, linguistically or culturally distinct from the rest of the Arabs. And we know up to 1948, there really was not a Palestinian identity in the way that word is used today. There wasn't a Palestinian Arab identity. There were Arabs, and that was the language of the UN partition agreement. There should be an Arab state and a Jewish state. They never said a Palestinian state because the Arabs were Arabs. They weren't ethnically distinct from the large community of Arabs in the many countries around them. So in that sense, there isn't an ethnic group, or there wasn't an ethnic group called Palestinians. It was literally a geographic designation. If it happened to be a Muslim Arab who lived, actually, not doesn't have to be Muslim, an Arab who lived in this area. It's like being a South Carolina or something like that, right? You were Palestinian. You're an Arab from that particular region. So that's how there can be Palestinians, even if there wasn't a previous Arab sovereign state. There was a geographic region known as Palestine, and Palestinians come from there. I'll add one more point, since I think this is beneath the surface of that question. The pro-Israel side sometimes argues there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, and maybe this question is connected to that idea. And the element, in my view, the element of truth in that is that there wasn't a Palestinian people up until the 1940s or so. That wasn't a distinct identity. There were other forms of identity in place, but not that identity. Where I tend to resist that particular move made by some pro-Israel people is, it seems to me undeniable now that there is a Palestinian people now, and indeed the very actions of Zionism, which was a Jewish national identity, combined with the war of 1948 and the creation of all those refugees, that created a very identity-forming shared historical experience that makes a people a people. And so I think it's quite reasonable. I think it's unreasonable to deny that the Palestinians are a people in the year 2024. But it comes from a kernel of truth. There wasn't really a Palestinian identity up through about the 1940s, and it becomes really an issue and emphasized from the 1960s onwards. So there's a kernel of truth there, but the facts of history, I think, have created a people at this, in my view, at this particular point. Thank you for that question.
Okay. Just on that note, could you trace Judy Newton asks, I've heard about Palestine from biblical times. What is the historical meaning is there in Palestine?
There is no Palestine in biblical times, but I think I know what you said. This was Judy.
Yes.
I think I know what Judy means, and does trace way back. I think we might have discussed this in one of the first installments of the series many moons ago. But the word Palestine itself, there's two different theories about its origin. On one of the theories, it comes from the Hebrew word for invaders and refers to and this is maybe the biblical part, the Philistines. So the Philistines are people in the Bible, and they come from, they're like Greeks, basically. They come from the Aegean Sea, and they invade the land of Israel, and that's how they keep house there for a few centuries before they finally disappear into history. So Philistines are invaders. And then the second is there are, I don't know, something like 300 or 400 BCE, for the year, one or more Greek historians refer to the land of Israel as Palestina, whatever the Greek version of that word is. And interestingly, in Greek, that word means wrestlers, as in WRESTLE, wrestler. And you might say, well, why would the Greeks refer to the land of Israel, the land of the wrestlers? Well, what Israel mean in Hebrew? It means like he who wrestled with God. So the Jews were the wrestlers. So those are the two theories, as far as I know, about where the word Palestine comes from. Neither one has anything to do with Palestinian Arabs, right? They're not talking about Arabs. If anything, the Palestinians are either invaders from outside, the Philistines, or the word Palestine literally refers to the Jews. The Jews are the original Palestinians. They are the wrestlers in the Greek, the Greek history tradition there. The region itself gets renamed Palestine by the Romans, of course, after the Roman conquest of Judea in the 2nd century, I believe, is when they name it, after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And they rename, instead of calling it Judea, they give it the new name of Syria Palestina. And the going theory is they wanted to simply erase Jewish presence and history there, and so they renamed it either for they renamed it for the Philistines on that particular view. But in none of these cases is the word refer to the people we call Palestinians today. So it's a kind of interesting irony, and I would imagine it'd be a painful irony to a Palestinian to say that you're named for the Jews, right? Like, but that seems to be. And even the Philistine, it's being named from the Jewish perspective. It's in the Bible that they're called Philistines. It's the Jews calling these people Philistines because they're invaders, right? So either way, the word Palestine is a Jewish name. And yet today it's the name of these people.
Okay. Gary Drucker asks, given all you said, how is Israel's behavior apartheid?
How is it? So it isn't. So yeah, right. So he's asking, I guess,
Right. How can you call Israel's behavior apartheid?
The next line. Well, I'll tell you the haters, their basis for it. First, they claim that there is significant, they will say, massive discrimination within the state of Israel against its Arab citizens, who they like to call Palestinians. They call them Palestinians. What's interestingly is most surveys seem to show, as far as I'm aware, that most is. Are you there? I just got an unstable. Okay. Most surveys seem to show, as far as I'm aware, that most Israeli Arabs prefer to be known as Israeli Arabs, not as Palestinians. But the haters outside will call all the Arab citizens of Israel Palestinians to sort of emphasize this. So they'll claim, first of all, massive discrimination. There is, of course, discrimination in Israel. Every country in the world suffers majorities discriminate against minorities. Look at the United States the last few years. But discrimination, of course, is not apartheid. And indeed, Israel endlessly take measures to try to diminish the discrimination, which is a universal phenomenon. The second part of the lie, the claim, is that they focus on the occupied territories, the West Bank, they would call them Judea, Samaria, and they'll claim essentially that Jews and Palestinians, and there it is accurate to call them Palestinians, they're not Israeli Arabs, that Jews and Palestinians live under two different legal systems. And there is a kernel of truth in that. They do live under two different legal systems, but the reason is Palestinians are not Israeli citizens. They are under their own government. The Palestinian Authority actually directly governs somewhere between 90 and 95% of the Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria. They are citizens of the Palestinian Authority. So, of course, they have different laws than the state of Israel. And so that simple fact alone just destroys the whole apartheid claim. Again, the claim is based on the idea that there are different laws that govern the two populations. If they were within one country, if, for example, white people, one set of laws applied to white people, and another set of laws applied to people of color in the United States, and that would be discrimination, that would be apartheid of some sort. But it's not apartheid that different laws apply to citizens of different countries, right? And that's the basis. So, and then the last absurdity of it is that that if you look at Israel's laws, Israel enshrines in its basic laws equality before the law. Again, there is de facto discrimination because that's unavoidable in every country in the world, but the legal system strives for and largely achieves equality before the law. Every citizen is equal before the law in Israel, which is simply not true of any of Israel's neighbors or enemies, right? All of them, if you want true apartheid, starting with the Palestinian Authority, which not only refuses to have a single Jew allowed to live there, but there are laws against selling land to Jews. And there's, of course, the famous pay to slay policy that they support payments to murderers of Jews. So if that's not apartheid, I don't know what is. So where there's true apartheid is actually on the other side once again. So that's a very brief summary of what would have been a longer treatment had we gotten to lie 8, I think.
There is a lot to digest here.
Good.
One last question, and if you can answer it in 2 minutes and give us a wrap up of what you haven't had a chance to say. Why do so many American Jews believe this false narrative? Can you answer that in 2 minutes?
Oh, gee, wonderful question. So many Jews believe this false narrative. So many people believe this false narrative, but especially the Jews know better. I think that's a failure on the Jewish community's part, first and foremost. Jews, American Jews. I'm going to pontificate. I guess I've been pontificating the whole way, but I have a platform, so I'm going to use it. There's a lot that's arguable and debatable here, but we've assimilated to a very, very large degree. And when we assimilate, we lose the thrust of our Jewish identity. And the cost of assimilating is feeling more American for many, many American Jews. And I would argue it's the heart of Jewish identity is some sort of connection to or affiliation with the land of Israel. Jewish people living there doesn't necessarily mean you have to like the current government, but the idea that you feel some sort of connection to and support of Israel, despite it, to me, is integral to my Jewish identity. But many, many American Jews have become more American than Jews. And given the social pressures as the country, as at least the key areas of the country, such as college campuses, especially the more elite, prestigious campuses, have gone so left, progressive, woke, there's enormous pressures to reject Israel. And so many, many American Jews either haven't been raised with the knowledge of the history, which you need to refute the lies, and they haven't been raised with the sort of emotional connection to this land and even to this country and this state that makes them want to fight back the lies, and then combine that with the social pressure to disavow Israel. And there you go, right? It's easy to just flip to the other side, or at least be quiet. So I think the short answer of that is we don't teach and stress, we don't teach and stress the history and the facts enough to our kids. And so they're not prepared. And then they're therefore very susceptible to the false narrative, as I've called it. So those are some speculative thoughts.
So thank you all for joining us.